Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Hellblazer Original Sins. Now, this collects the first 9 issues of the comic book series Hellblazer from DC and Vertgio, which were written by Jamie Delano and illustrated by John Ridgway. However, this also collects a 2-issue Swamp Thing story that directly picks up where Hellblazer issue 9 left off. And the first of the 2 Swamp Thing issues that are collected in here is written by Rick Veitch. Now, these first 9 issues of Hellblazer were published in 1988, and this series is actually a spin-off of the Swamp Thing comics. Now, Swamp Thing is a series originally created by Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson, but Alan Moore took over the series in the mid-80s and completely reinvented the character to a point where you could honestly call Alan Moore's Swamp Thing its own separate series. But one of the big things that Alan Moore did during his run on Swamp Thing was introducing the character of John Constantine, who was sort of a modern-day wizard/demon hunter, and he would constantly send Swamp Thing on all these supernatural missions. But this character proved popular enough to get his own spin-off series. Now, these comics were also the basis for the 2005 film Constantine with Keanu Reeves. Now, personally, I love that movie. Yes, I know it's a terrible adaptation of the comics, but on its own, I think it's a really good action horror film. But then you had the NBC series Constantine, which I haven't watched yet, but from what I understand, it is a lot closer to the source material. And Constantine has also appeared in several of DC's animated films like Justice League Dark and Constantine City of Demons. Now, after finally reading the issues collected in this volume, I definitely see why Hellblazer is such a revered comic book series, and why the character of John Constantine is such a beloved character. Because these are great horror comics, but there's also a lot of really good political satire in here. Now, a lot of it is sort of poking fun at British politics, and I'll admit some of the satire went a little over my head, only because I wasn't alive when these comics were published, and also I'm not from the UK. But there is a lot of social commentary in here that you could very much apply to American society, and is still very much relevant today. Now, this volume opens up with a 2-part story comprised of the issues Hunger and A Feast of Friends. But this story deals with a former friend of Constantine who has become a drug addict, and it turns out he recently captured a demon named Memeth, or Memeth. I'm not really sure how to say the demon's name right, but this demon is accidentally released in New York City. But basically, this demon, it possesses people, and it causes whoever it possesses to feel extreme, insatiable hunger, where they have to eat, but the more they eat, the more they starve. But also, their hunger is based on whatever their obsession is. So, in the story, Constantine and this friend of his travel to New York City, and Constantine acquires the help of a witch doctor named Papa Midnight. But in this story, you see how ruthless Constantine can be, because let's just say things do not end well for this friend of his at all. Basically, you see how Constantine is willing to sacrifice people if it means stopping a demon. Now, you could argue it's for the greater good, but he's still fucking people over. But I like how this story portrays magic as being almost like a drug, almost like something that you could get addicted to. And Constantine, whether he means to or not, is almost like the dealer. Like, you get the idea that Constantine is the one who got this friend of his hooked on magic, who brought him into this world of the supernatural. Now, Jamie Delano also brings back some other characters from Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. Now, in Swamp Thing, Constantine had a few allies who ended up getting killed in those comics, and in these comics, you see that Constantine is being haunted by their ghosts. It's this whole idea that anybody who follows Constantine ends up getting killed, so Constantine is a man with a lot of guilt and a lot of ghosts following him around, both literally and figuratively. The next issue collected in here is called Goin' For It, and this one kind of deals with the idea of what if hell has a stock market, only instead of dealing in money, they deal in souls. Like, basically, human souls are currency in hell. And the story is taking place on the eve of Britain's general election, and it turns out that the demons are banking on Margaret Thatcher getting elected for a third term in order to sway Hell's stock market in their favor. This was a very interesting story, and it is sort of a middle finger to yuppie culture by suggesting that yuppies are literal demons. It's also sort of a middle finger to the right wing, so if you do lean that way politically, you might not like this story. The next issue collected in here is called Waiting for the Man. Now, while this does work as a standalone story, it also sets up so much that will happen in the issues that follow this. Basically, in this issue, Constantine's niece, Gemma, meets these three little girls who say they'll take her back to their place, and they all claim that they're married, even though these are all little girls, and they're all married to one guy. They take her back to their house to be this guy's next wife. It turns out that Gemma has been kidnapped by a demon-worshipping pedophile, and Constantine hears about this, so him and this woman he just met named Zed start looking for her. Now, Gemma's parents, who are Constantine's sister and brother-in-law, they have recently joined this religious cult called the Resurrection Crusade, and they start getting in Constantine's way as he's trying to find this pedophile. But this was a very good issue, and as I said, it works as a standalone story, but it does set up a lot of things that will happen later on. But what really works about this, and what really makes this issue scary, is even though it has a supernatural twist, this is dealing with real-world horror. There are pedophiles out there. Child abduction is a real thing, and this is very much dealing with those issues, obviously with a supernatural bent. And Zed is a very interesting character. The next issue featured in this collection is called When Johnny Comes Marching Home, and in this one, John Constantine comes to America and ends up in this small town in Idaho called Liberty. And it turns out that of all the young men from this town who went to the Vietnam War, only one of them returned. The others were missing in action. And the people in this town start seeing the Resurrection Crusade on TV saying that their prayers have the power to bring their loved ones back. So many of the people in this town start to believe that their sons will come home, and in the story you see the past and the present start to become merged together, and time and space starts to become warped, and the boys do come home, unfortunately not in the way that their families would have wanted, and the ending of the story is both tragic and pretty horrifying. But this was a very good issue, and a pretty powerful story, actually. Now, in the story, Constantine is not very heroic. He's really just there as sort of a passive observer, but he doesn't really do anything to try to stop what's happening. Like, you kind of get the idea that maybe he can't. And I don't know if maybe that was meant to make a commentary on how, unless you were there, most people did witness the Vietnam War vicariously through television or with the generations after the Vietnam War via movies based on the war. And in this story, you see the war coming home to America in a really terrifying way. And the story is very much a commentary on how, even by the 1980s, which is when this comic was first published, the Vietnam War was still very much haunting American society. Now, this issue actually reminded me a lot of an episode of the 80s Twilight Zone series called Nightcrawlers, which was actually based on a story by Robert McCammon. Now, with the next 4 issues collected in this volume, technically you could read each one as a standalone, but this is where you really start to notice the serialization starting to happen, where each issue is picking up where the last one left off, so put together they all tell one story. But the issues are Extreme Prejudice, Ghost in the Machine, Intensive Care, and Shot to Hell. But basically, in these issues, you find out that Zed, the woman who helped Constantine find his niece, was actually a former member of the Resurrection Crusade, and they now want her back. But there's also a demon named Nurgle who is going after her for the same reasons that the Resurrection Crusade wants her. Nurgle basically becomes the main antagonist of this story, and I know for a while he was basically Constantine's arch-nemesis, at least until the First of the Fallen was introduced into the series. But these issues, while they tell a great horror story, there's also a lot of really powerful social commentary at play here. Like, they touch on themes like religious intolerance, homophobia, the AIDS epidemic. Like, in the comic, Constantine has a gay friend who has AIDS, but the way the comic handles this character is very mature. And this is where you could really tell that Jamie Delano was apparently handpicked by Alan Moore to write these Constantine stories, because, like Alan Moore, he's touching on a lot of real-world issues in his comics. Now, while you don't have to read Swamp Thing in order to understand this, there are some direct tie-ins with Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. For example, in Swamp Thing, there was a huge plotline where it turns out that there was this darkness that existed before God created the universe, and there was this evil cult that was trying to bring this darkness back, and this darkness threatened to destroy heaven and earth. But at a certain point during the battle for heaven, God intervened and then merged with this darkness. But it turns out, because of this union between darkness and light, hell is now engaged in a civil war. And that also kind of directly ties in with Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, which is in the same universe as this, where you found out that because of recent events, Lucifer is no longer the sole ruler of hell. Now, this volume ends with a two-part Swamp Thing story that picks up right where Hellblazer issue 9 left off. And this two-part Swamp Thing story is taken from Rick Veitch's run. Rick Veitch took over that series after Alan Moore was done with it. Basically, in these two issues, you find out that Swamp Thing and Abby need to have a child. It's implied that if this child is not born, it will mean bad things for the world. And this child will be the next Swamp Thing. The issue is, Swamp Thing is only a sentient plant, so in order for Swamp Thing and Abby to have this child, Swamp Thing needs to possess Constantine. Now, of course, Abby is apprehensive about this because she, in her own words, despises Constantine. But this was a really good two-parter, and it's actually a nice change of pace considering how dark the issues of Hellblazer leading up to this were, and there's actually a lot of humor in this story. Like, Swamp Thing can make new bodies out of different plants, so when you first see Swamp Thing in this issue, he makes a body out of the tobacco in Constantine's cigarettes, but then Constantine takes some of the tobacco off of Swamp Thing's body and starts smoking it. And in this, you see that Swamp Thing actually has a sense of humor, and even though him and Constantine are allies, he does not like Constantine at all, so when he possesses Constantine, he plays a little prank on him where he goes into a tattoo shop and gets this stupid tattoo on Constantine's ass. So again, this Swamp Thing story is a nice change of pace considering how dark and kind of nihilistic the issues of Hellblazer leading up to this were. But yeah, I definitely recommend these comics if you're a fan of horror comics, if you're a fan of dark fantasy, but also if you're a fan of comic book characters who aren't your traditional heroes, who are much more realistic, who are much more flawed than something like Superman or Batman. Actually, Batman might be a bad example because he is a pretty flawed character himself, but if you're a fan of your non-traditional comic book character, then definitely check these out. But I would also recommend this if you're a fan of superhero comics that have their basis in demonology or even theology, something like Spawn or Hellboy. But yeah, that was my review on Hellblazer Volume 1, Original Sins, and bye.